Let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this for a second before you answer. What did you do last night between 6 o'clock and midnight? Most people, if they're being honest, can't fully account for those hours. Maybe some television, maybe scrolling through a phone, maybe you told yourself you were relaxing, that you'd earned it, that tomorrow you do something different. And the night before that, probably the same. And the night before that. 6 hours every single evening, quietly slipping away. Now multiply that by 30 years. That's not just lost time. That's a lost life. And more than that, it's a lost fortune. Not because you didn't work hard enough. Not because the market didn't give you opportunities, but because nobody ever taught you what those 6 hours were really worth. That's what we're going to talk about today. Not in a way that makes you feel guilty, but in a way that by the end of this, you'll see things just a little bit differently. And sometimes a little bit different is all it takes to change everything. I want to start with a truth that most people in the financial world don't like to say out loud because it makes the whole industry feel uncomfortable. The biggest threat to your financial future is not a market crash. It's not inflation. It's not your salary. The biggest threat to your financial future is what you do when nothing urgent is happening. It's the long, quiet stretches of ordinary evenings where the habits of your financial life are either being built or slowly being destroyed. And most people don't even realize a decision is being made. We live in a country that has produced more wealth than any civilization in human history. The tools available to an ordinary American today, the ability to own a piece of great businesses, to earn compound returns, to build real lasting wealth across decades. These tools didn't exist for most of human history. A farmer in 1870 could not wake up, open a small account, and place a few dollars into a diversified ownership stake in the most productive companies on earth. You can, right now, in your pajamas, before breakfast. And yet, despite that extraordinary access, the average American retires with less than $100,000 saved. Let that land for a moment. A lifetime of work, 40 years of showing up. And the finish line looks like $100,000. That's not a failure of opportunity. That's a failure of habit. And habits, as it turns out, are mostly built or broken in the evening. Now, I'm not here to lecture you about cutting out coffee or canceling subscriptions. That's not what this is about. This is something much deeper than that. This is about the mental architecture you build during the quiet hours. The thinking, the learning, the decisions you make or refuse to make when the pressure is off and the market is closed and nobody's watching. Because here's what I've come to understand after watching people build and lose and rebuild wealth across many, many years. Your financial outcome has very little to do with your peak moments of brilliance. It has almost everything to do with what you do in the ordinary ones. Think about a man I'll call Robert. Robert was a middle school science teacher in Ohio. Modest salary, nothing glamorous. He wasn't a particularly sophisticated investor. He didn't read dense financial textbooks or follow earnings calls. But Robert had one habit that he'd built quietly over decades. Every Sunday evening, he sat down at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, opened a simple notebook, and wrote 3 things: what he'd bought that month, why he'd bought it, and whether anything had changed about why he'd bought it. That was it. No complicated charts, no technical analysis, just a quiet Sunday evening ritual that kept him honest with himself and clear about his reasoning. Robert retired at 62. He had never earned more than $68,000 a year in his entire career, but he had built a portfolio worth slightly over $2 million. Not because he was brilliant, because he was consistent, because he never let the noise of a bad week convince him that his long-term reasoning was wrong, because his evenings weren't spent absorbing panic, they were spent reinforcing clarity. Now compare that to another person I want you to think about. I'll call her Michelle. Michelle was sharp, genuinely smart, made good money, had real financial advantages that Robert never had. But Michelle spent her evenings differently. She watched financial news that was designed not to inform her, but to provoke her. Every dip in the market triggered a feeling. Every headline made her feel like she needed to act. So she acted. She moved money around when she shouldn't have. She pulled out of positions that were working beautifully because one bad week scared her into selling. She chased opportunities that looked exciting and punished her for the chase. By 65, Michelle had worked harder than Robert by almost any measure and had less than a quarter of what he'd built. The difference between Robert and Michelle was not intelligence. It was not luck. It was not access. It was what they did with the quiet hours, and more importantly, what they allowed into their minds during those hours. Here is something that took me a long time to really understand. And I mean understand it in the bones, not just know it intellectually. The stock market is the greatest wealth-building mechanism in human history. For people who can control their emotions, and one of the most efficient wealth destruction machines ever created for people who cannot. And emotional control is not something you find in the heat of the moment. It is something you build in the ordinary, unremarkable evenings when there's nothing at stake and no crisis demanding your attention. You build it like a muscle, slowly, repeatedly, in the quiet. Most people have it completely backwards. They think the important financial decisions happen during dramatic moments, during crashes, during booms, during those breathless news cycles, when everyone is either running towards something or running away from it. But those moments are just tests. The real work happens before the test. And the preparation for those tests happens in the evening hours that most people are throwing away. Let me give you a very specific and painful example of what I mean. March of 2020. You remember it. The world was shutting down. The market fell 34% in 33 days. That is one of the fastest and most violent market declines in recorded history. People were terrified. And in that terror, millions of ordinary Americans made a decision, many of them in a panic, late at night, staring at their phones, to sell, to get out, to stop the bleeding. It felt like the rational thing to do. The world genuinely felt like it might be ending. Those people locked in a 34% loss. And then, because this is what markets do, the market recovered completely within 5 months, and then went on to double from its pre-crash highs over the next 2 years. The people who sold in a panic didn't just lose money once. They lost money twice, once when they sold low, and again when they bought back in high, which many of them eventually did, because the fear of missing out is almost as powerful as the fear of loss. Now, what separates the people who held through that crash from the people who didn't? Most people will say it's courage. I'd argue it's something quieter than that. It's the preparation of months and years spent understanding what they owned and why they owned it. It's the habit of reading, thinking, journaling, learning, done in the evenings, long before any crisis arrived. When you truly understand what you own, a price drop becomes less frightening. When you know the fundamentals haven't changed, the panic around you becomes something you can observe with curiosity rather than something that pulls you under with it. But you have to build that knowledge before the storm, not during it. Nobody learns to swim in a flood. And this brings me to what I believe is the single most underrated hour in the financial life of an ordinary American. It's the hour right after dinner somewhere between 7 and 8 in the evening, before exhaustion fully sets in, after the obligations of the day have been met. Most people surrender that hour to passive consumption, not because they're lazy, because nobody has ever suggested that it might be the most powerful investing hour of their life. What would it look like to use that hour differently? Not dramatically, not with some rigid self-improvement regimen that collapses after 3 days. Just deliberately. What if you spent 30 minutes reading about a company you were considering owning? Not a stock tip, not a rumor, but the actual business. What it makes, how it makes money, who runs it, and whether they have a track record of making good decisions. What the competitive landscape looks like. Whether the business would still make sense in 10 years, even if the economy went sideways. What if you spent another 30 minutes thinking about your own financial situation with the same quiet honesty, not obsessing, not catastrophizing, just asking real questions? Do I understand why I own what I own? Am I carrying debt that costs me more than my investments are earning? Am I saving a percentage that will actually matter in 20 years? Or am I saving just enough to feel like I'm doing something? These are not comfortable questions. That's why people don't ask them. But they are the questions that, when answered honestly and acted on slowly, change everything. I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in financial conversations, and that's the cost of waiting for certainty. Because one of the great ironies of investing is that the conditions that feel the safest to invest in, markets at highs, economy growing, confidence widespread, are often precisely the conditions that offer the least value. And the conditions that feel most dangerous, markets falling, uncertainty everywhere, headlines screaming doom, are often precisely when the greatest opportunities are quietly presenting themselves. This is not counterintuitive if you think about it clearly. If you are shopping for a coat and the store marks it down 40%, you don't panic and walk out. You buy 2 coats. But because money is involved, because emotions are wired into every dollar sign in a way they're not wired into a coat, people respond to discounts in markets by running from them. Learning to see clearly when everyone around you is seeing fearfully is perhaps the greatest skill in all of investing. And it is a skill. It is not a personality trait you're born with. It is something you develop slowly through reading, through thinking, through honest reflection, through the intentional use of ordinary evenings. Here is a hypothetical that I want you to think about carefully. Imagine 2 people, both 35 years old, both earning $60,000 a year. One of them, starting tonight, commits to investing $500 a month into a diversified index fund and never stops, not for recessions, not for crashes, not for the moments when the news is terrifying. The other one means to start investing, but keeps waiting for the right time, waiting until the market calms down, waiting until they feel more financially settled, waiting. 25 years later, at age 60, the first person, assuming a historically reasonable average annual return, has built somewhere in the range of $500,000. The second person, who waited until 40 to start doing the same thing, has somewhere around $200,000. The gap between them is not effort. It is not intelligence. It is not even the amount invested per month. The gap is entirely made of the time that the first person didn't waste. Time is the one resource that markets will compound for you with extraordinary faithfulness if you give them the chance. But you cannot get time back. And every evening spent consuming passive entertainment instead of building the knowledge and habits that lead to confident, sustained investment behavior is an evening where time is working against you instead of for you. Now, I want to address something directly because I suspect some of you are sitting with a particular thought right now. You might be thinking, I tried investing before and I lost money. Or, I watched my parents lose money and I decided the stock market isn't for people like me. Or maybe you're thinking, I don't have enough to make it matter. I want to talk to that part of you honestly because it deserves an honest conversation. Losing money in the market, which virtually everyone who has ever invested seriously has experienced, is not evidence that the market is broken or that you are not meant to participate in it. In almost every case, losing money in the market is not a market failure. It is a behavioral failure. It is selling when you should have held. It is buying something you didn't understand because someone made it sound exciting. It is making emotional decisions with money that deserved patient, rational decisions. And I say this not to assign blame, but to offer something more useful than blame, which is the recognition that if your past losses came from behavior, then better behavior going forward changes the outcome. The market itself is not your enemy. Fear is your enemy. Impatience is your enemy. The absence of understanding is your enemy. All of these things can be addressed in the evening, quietly, over time. And to the person who says, I don't have enough to make it matter, I want to be very direct. $100 a month at 30 years old, invested consistently for 30 years, can become something meaningful. Not life-changing all on its own, I'll be honest with you. But here's what matters more than the number. The habit of consistent investing, started small and maintained faithfully, almost always grows. People who start with $100 a month find that as their income grows, as their perspective shifts, as they see the account actually building, they find ways to add more. The habit is the seed. The amounts grow naturally from there. What never grows is a habit that never starts. I want to share one more image with you before we close this out, because I think it captures everything I've been trying to say more clearly than any statistic can. Picture an old farmer. Not a romantic Hollywood image of a farmer, just a real one. He gets up early. He does his work. But here's what sets him apart from the neighbor whose farm has been struggling for 30 years. At the end of every day, the old farmer goes out to the back of his property and plants one tree, just one. It doesn't take long. He's tired. It would be very easy not to do it. Nobody's watching. The tree won't provide shade for 15 or 20 years. But he plants it anyway, every single evening. Not because of some burst of inspiration or discipline, because he has simply accepted a truth that most people resist. The planting and the harvest are separated by time, and the only way to get to the harvest is to plant faithfully before you can see the result. The investor who builds genuine, lasting wealth is doing the same thing. Not dramatically, not heroically, just faithfully. Every evening, a little reading, a little thinking, a little decision-making about what to own and why, a little practice at not panicking, a little strengthening of the patience that will be required when the next crisis arrives, and it will arrive. We are living in one of the most remarkable periods of human economic history. The tools available to you are extraordinary. The companies you can own pieces of right now, tonight, for a few $100s, represent engineering and innovation and human ingenuity on a scale that would have seemed like science fiction 100 years ago. The ability to participate in that, to become an owner of the future rather than just a consumer of it, is available to almost any working American who chooses to take it seriously. But taking it seriously doesn't mean obsessing over it. It doesn't mean spending 6 hours a night consumed by financial news or checking prices every 20 minutes. Quite the opposite. Taking it seriously means building the quiet, consistent habits of an informed, patient, emotionally steady investor. It means using the evening hours with some intention, reading something that makes you smarter, thinking about your financial situation with honesty rather than avoidance, making small, deliberate improvements to your position, and then letting time do the work that only time can do. The market will go up. It will go down. There will be a crash that feels catastrophic. There will be a recovery that seems miraculous. Headlines will make you feel like the world is ending, and then 3 months later, those same outlets will be talking about the bull market. None of that is within your control. The only thing within your control is who you are as an investor, the depth of your understanding, the strength of your patience, the clarity of your thinking when those moments arrive. And who you are as an investor is built one evening at a time in the quiet hours between 6 and midnight. You have 6 hours tonight. The question is what you're going to do with them, not all of them. You don't need to transform your entire evening, just 1 hour tonight. Use it to read something that makes you a better investor. Use it to look honestly at your financial picture and ask one real question. Use it to set up an automatic investment if you haven't already. Use it to stop consuming panic and start building understanding. 1 hour tonight, and then tomorrow night, and the night after that. The farmer doesn't plant all the trees in one night. He plants one tree every night for the rest of his life. That's the secret. It always has been. It's just slower than people want it to be and quieter than they expected. But it works. It has always worked. It will work for you if you start tonight and refuse to stop. The best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. The second best time is this evening.